Our drone filmed a giant Sasquatch dismembering a grizzly, then it noticed us. The thermal camera showed a 9-foot creature tearing apart a 600-pound bear with its bare hands near Wolverine Creek. 20 years studying wildlife, and nothing prepared me for this. The thing used stone tools, sorted body parts like following some ritual. When it looked up at our drone 150 feet above, its eyes glowed red. Then it threw the bear's severed leg at us with impossible accuracy. The government took our footage and threatened us with prison, but I kept backups. What happens when the ultimate predator knows we're watching? Your time here matters. Choosing stillness in a busy world makes you one of us. Thanks for being here. I've spent 2 decades tracking predators across some of North America's most remote wilderness areas. But something about this autumn felt different from the moment I stepped onto the gravel airstrip at Cluin. The late September air carried that familiar crisp bite, and the aspens had already started their golden transformation against the dark spruce backdrop. But there was an unfamiliar tension in my shoulders as I hauled my gear toward the research station, where Riley Thorne, my graduate student, was already setting up our equipment. "Dr. Brutus," Riley called out, waving from the doorway of our modest facility. She'd arrived yesterday to prep the thermal imaging drone and review our protocols. "The calibration's almost complete, and I've got the tracking data pulled up for all 17 tagged bears in the study area." I nodded, dropping my heavy pack inside. The station was essentially a glorified cabin, 2 small bedrooms, a basic kitchen, and what we'd converted into our command center, filled with monitors, hard drives, and satellite communication equipment. The drone itself sat on the workbench, looking like an expensive toy, but representing nearly $50,000 of university funding. "How many of the bears are still active?" I asked, pulling out my worn field journal. 20 years of observations were recorded in these pages, each entry methodically dated and located. The binding was starting to fail, but I couldn't bring myself to switch to digital notes entirely. 13 showing regular movement patterns, Riley replied, pulling up the tracking data on her laptop. 4 have already started denning behavior. But GZ442, that big male we tagged in June, has been making some unusual movements in the northern sector. I leaned over her shoulder, studying the GPS plots. Unusual how? He's been circling this same 2-mile radius for the past week, but not following any of the game trails or usual feeding patterns. And he's mostly moving at night, which isn't typical for this time of year. Riley's fingers flew across the keyboard, bringing up thermal imaging from our fixed cameras. The weird thing is, we're not picking up any significant heat signatures in that area that would indicate a food source. I rubbed my jaw, feeling the stubble from 2 days of travel. Could be a glitch in the tag. We'll make that area a priority for the drone survey tonight. Riley hesitated, then said, "I was talking to some of the local First Nations people while getting supplies in town. They mentioned that area has some history of strange activity." "Riley," I sighed. "I've heard all the stories over the years. Spirit bears, giant wolves, creatures from folklore. But in 20 years of field research, I've never seen anything that couldn't be explained by known species and natural phenomena." I pulled out my checklist for the drone equipment. "Let's focus on the actual science." She nodded, but I could tell she wanted to say more. Instead, she turned back to the calibration sequence, adjusting the thermal imaging sensitivity. "The new software update is amazing," she said after a moment. "We're getting much clearer heat signatures, even through the canopy. And the AI can now distinguish between species with about 95% accuracy." I began unpacking my own gear, laying out the backup hard drives and checking the satellite phone. Cell service was non-existent out here, and our only link to the outside world was this phone and the emergency beacon. The isolation had never bothered me before. In fact, it was one of the reasons I'd chosen this career. After my divorce 5 years ago, The solitude of field research had become even more appealing. Battery packs are all charged, Riley reported, running through her checklist. Weather forecast shows clear skies tonight, perfect for thermal imaging. And I've programmed the flight path to cover both the anomalous area and our regular survey grid. I nodded, pleased with her thoroughness. Riley had proven to be one of my most capable graduate students, despite her occasional tendency to get distracted by local legends. Good work. Let's get everything else squared away before sunset. I want to be ready to launch as soon as it's dark enough for optimal thermal contrast. The rest of the afternoon passed in the familiar routine of field preparation. We checked and double-checked equipment, reviewed emergency protocols, and organized our data collection sheets. Through the station's windows, I watched the sun sink toward the mountains, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples. In a few hours, we'd begin our survey, documenting the pre-hibernation behavior of Kluan's grizzly population. It was the kind of straightforward scientific work I'd built my career on, observable, measurable, and grounded in reality. The next 2 days fell into the comfortable rhythm of field research that I'd perfected over decades. Riley proved herself invaluable, managing our dawn launches with precision while I handled the dusk operations. The thermal imaging drone hummed quietly above the canopy, its sophisticated sensors capturing heat signatures of our tagged subjects. G12 is exactly where we'd expect her, I noted on our second morning, watching the bear's heat signature move along Miller Creek. Classic pre-hibernation feeding pattern. I made detailed notes in my journal, comparing them to previous year's data. Riley nodded, her eyes fixed on the monitor. She's put on good weight too, based on her movement patterns. But look at this. She pulled up a map overlay from our database. G27 through G45 are all following traditional routes. But there's something odd about the historical data. I leaned closer, adjusting my reading glasses. The screen showed migration patterns from the past 5 years, color-coded by season. See these valleys? Riley pointed to several dark zones on the map. Bears consistently avoid them, even though our habitat. Surveys show plenty of food sources. It's not just 1 or 2 bears either. It's a pattern across multiple individuals and years. Probably natural predator corridors, I replied, though I had to admit the consistency was interesting. Wolves use those valleys, and bears, especially. Females with cubs will often avoid high-traffic predator routes. But we don't have any wolf pack territories mapped in those specific areas, Riley countered, pulling up another dataset. And the avoidance behavior is too uniform. It's like they're all responding to the same. Riley, I cut her off gently. Animals develop behavioral patterns based on countless environmental factors. Not everything needs a special explanation. She pressed her lips together but didn't argue. We spent the rest of the morning processing footage from the previous night's flights, cataloging feeding sites and marking GPS coordinates of bedding areas. By evening, we had solid data on 15 of our tagged subjects. The drone's thermal imaging was performing exceptionally well, giving us crystal clear heat signatures even through dense forest cover. I found myself repeatedly checking the footage of G37, a large male showing textbook pre-hibernation behavior. This is exactly what we need for the paper, I told Riley as we downloaded the day's final files. Clear evidence of consistent behavioral patterns across multiple seasons. The peer reviewers won't be able to argue with this data. Riley was quiet for a moment, then said, I've been comparing the thermal imaging from different times of day. The bear's heat signatures are consistent, but there are these other anomalies in some valleys. Brief heat blooms that don't match any known species profile. Probably equipment artifacts, I said, closing my journal. Let's focus on what we can verify. The evening of September 24th brought a welcome break in the clouds. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in deep purples, our tracking Equipment picked up G47's radio collar signal near Wolverine Creek. 8 miles from the logging road, Riley noted, checking the coordinates. That's unusually far north for him. I adjusted the drone's flight path, guiding it toward the signal. G47 was one of our most impressive specimens, a male, grizzly weighing in at roughly 600 pounds during his last capture and tagging operation. The thermal imaging screen flickered to life as we located him in a small clearing. Something's off about his behavior, Riley said, leaning closer to the monitor. I had to agree. Instead of the typical evening foraging we'd expect, G47 was repeatedly rising onto his hind legs, his heat signature bright against the cooling forest background. The bear's head moved back and forth, and even through our equipment, we could see him huffing, powerful exhalations that suggested agitation or alarm. He's scenting something, I said, manipulating the drone's controls to get a better angle. But there's nothing else showing up on thermal in that area. Riley adjusted the infrared sensitivity. Could be just outside our range. These units are good, but they do have limits. We watched for another 20 minutes as G47 continued his unusual display. When darkness finally forced us to land the drone, we decided to check the area on foot the next morning, keeping a safe distance. Of course, the following dawn found us examining the trees around where we'd spotted G47. The bear was long gone, but he'd left plenty of evidence behind. Fresh claw marks scored several trunks, but what caught my attention was their height. This can't be right, I muttered, measuring one set of scratches with my rangefinder. 11 feet, 8 inches up. Even for G47, that's... I trailed off, rechecking the measurement. Could he have reared up on a log or something? Riley suggested, photographing the marks. I searched the base of the tree but found no fallen logs or rocks that could have given the bear extra height. Even then, it's pushing the limits of what we know about grizzly reach. G47 is big, but this is exceptional. We documented everything according to protocol, measurements, photographs, GPS coordinates. I told myself it must be due to G47's unusual size, combined with perhaps some natural feature we couldn't spot that allowed him to reach so high. It had to be something that simple. But as we headed back to our research trailer, I couldn't shake the image of those impossibly high claw marks. September 26th started with an anomaly in our data. Over breakfast, Riley pointed to G47's movement patterns on her laptop screen. Look at this, Dr. Brutus. He's been completely stationary for hours at a time, then suddenly racing across his territory at speeds we rarely see in grizzlies. Collar data shows him covering nearly 2 miles in 20 minutes last night. I was about to respond when a knock at our trailer door interrupted us. Opening it, I found myself face to face with Silas Crowfeather, an elder from the local Champaign and Aishihik community. I'd met him briefly during our permit discussions last spring. "Good morning," he said, his weathered face grave. "I needed to speak with you before you head out today." I invited him in, offering coffee which he declined. Riley shifted uncomfortably in her chair as Silas settled himself at our small table. "The old giants are active this season," he said without preamble. "Especially around Wolverine Creek. You should avoid that area after dark." "Mr. Crowfeather," I began, keeping my tone respectful but firm. "We're conducting important research on grizzly migration patterns. Our data collection needs to continue regardless of the time of day." Silas's dark eyes fixed on me. "You've found the twisted trees, haven't you? And the bones arranged in ways bears don't arrange things." Riley's sharp intake of breath drew my attention. She'd gone pale. I did see some unusual formations yesterday," she admitted, "near the creek bend. I was going to mention it in today's report." "Riley," I cautioned, but Silas spoke over me. "The arrangements are messages," he said, "warnings. They mark boundaries that shouldn't be crossed, especially not now, when they're preparing for winter. I fought to maintain my professional composure. Mr. Crowfeather, while we respect traditional knowledge, we have to follow scientific protocols. We have a tagged bear showing unusual behavior patterns that need investigation. Some knowledge is older than science, Silas replied, standing slowly. Your machines see heat and movement, but they don't see everything. Remember that. He paused. At the door, if you must go there, leave before sunset. And if you hear wood knocking against wood, don't answer it. That's not meant for you. After he left, Riley sat in uncharacteristic silence, staring at her data screens. You're not letting his stories get to you, are you? I asked, trying to sound casual. It's just, he knew about the twisted trees. I haven't told anyone about finding those yet. And they were exactly where he said they'd be. The next evening, September 27th, we prepared for our routine twilight. Drone launched to check on G47. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across Wolverine Creek Valley as Riley ran through her pre-flight checklist. Caller signal is strong, she reported, eyes on her tablet. He's about half a mile upstream from yesterday's position. I nodded, checking the time, 7:30 p.m. Let's get eyes on him before we lose the light completely. The thermal imaging should give us clear contrast in these conditions. Riley launched the drone with practiced efficiency, guiding it toward G47's GPS coordinates. The infrared feed flickered to life on our monitors, showing the heat signatures of the landscape below, in ghostly blues and greens. There he is, I said, pointing to a bright orange-white blob near the creek bed. Zoom in. As the drone descended for a better view, something about the bear's movement caught my attention. The thermal signature was thrashing violently, rolling, and twisting in a way that immediately set off alarm bells in my mind. Could be a territorial dispute, Riley suggested, but her voice wavered with uncertainty. Maybe another male moved into his range? I leaned closer to the screen, frowning. Drop altitude, we need better resolution. The drone descended to about 200 feet, and the image sharpened. What I saw made my blood run cold. G47 wasn't fighting. Another bear. The massive grizzly was being held down by something that stood upright on two legs. The bipedal figure towered over the bear, its heat signature suggesting a size that defied explanation. That's not possible, I whispered. Riley's hands were shaking as she adjusted the drone's audio receiver. A horrible sound came through our speakers, the wet crack of breaking bones, followed by a deep, resonant vocalization unlike anything I'd ever heard in my decades of wildlife research. Dr. Brutus, Riley's voice was barely audible. The thermal scale, whatever's holding G47 down, it's reading at over 9 feet tall. Another crack echoed through the speakers, and the bear's thermal signature dimmed noticeably. The bipedal figure shifted its stance, and for a moment, it seemed to look directly up at our drone. Riley, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. Increase altitude, now. The audio feed, she started. Increase altitude. I snapped, but kept my eyes locked on the monitor, watching as the massive figure effortlessly manipulated the 600-pound grizzly like it was little more than a rag doll. I forced myself to keep watching, my scientific training battling against the primal urge to look away. Through the thermal imaging, I could see the creature's methodical movements with horrifying clarity. Its hands, massive things that dwarfed the bear's skull, moved with a precision that spoke of practiced familiarity. Record everything, I managed to say, my mouth dry. Switch to maximum resolution. Rayleigh's fingers trembled over the controls as she adjusted the settings. The creature's heat signature blazed bright on our screen, running significantly hotter than what we typically saw from humans or other mammals. I estimated its core temperature had to be at least 105 degrees Fahrenheit. It's using tools," Riley whispered, her voice thick with barely contained nausea. I could see her struggling to maintain her professional composure, but the horror of what we were witnessing was overwhelming. She was right. The thermal imaging clearly showed the creature wielding what appeared to be a crude stone implement. But there was nothing crude about how it used it. With disturbing efficiency, it began separating G47's limbs at the joints, the process showing an understanding of ursine anatomy that spoke of repeated experience. "Look at the organization," I found myself saying, my researcher's instincts kicking in despite the situation. "It's sorting the parts. This isn't random predation." The creature worked with a methodical precision that chilled me more than any display of brute force could have. It created distinct piles, separating meat from organs, bones from tissue. Its movements were economical, purposeful, displaying a level of intelligence that shattered every paradigm I'd built my career upon. I adjusted the thermal sensitivity, trying to capture more detail. The being's musculature was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The density and distribution suggested strength far beyond human capability. As it worked, I could see the play of muscle groups that had no equivalent in known primates. "Dr. Brutus." Riley's voice cracked. The audio. Through our speakers, we could hear the creature's breathing, deep, rhythmic sounds that seemed to resonate at a frequency that made my skin crawl. Occasionally, it would emit low vocalizations that appeared to follow a pattern, almost like it was counting. The thermal imaging revealed another disturbing detail. The creature's hands showed signs of opposable thumbs, but the digit arrangement was subtly different from human morphology. As it manipulated the stone tool, I could see it using grip configurations that would be impossible for human hands. "The core temperature differential," I muttered, more to keep myself grounded in scientific observation than anything else. "The metabolic implications alone." Riley suddenly lurched away from the monitor, barely making it to the waste bin before retching. I couldn't blame her. What we were watching violated everything we understood about North American wildlife. The creature's size alone was impossible. The thermal scaling suggested it had to mass at least 800 pounds, yet it moved with an agility that defied its bulk. Through the drone's cameras, I watched as it systematically completed its butchery. Each movement was precise, each cut deliberate. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. We were watching something that understood exactly what it was doing, something that had developed specific techniques for processing large prey. The implications were staggering, and I felt my worldview crumbling with each passing second of footage. The rhythmic sounds of butchery suddenly ceased. Through our monitor, I watched the creature's head snap up with unnatural speed, its attention now fully focused on our drone hovering 400 feet above. My breath caught in my throat as the night vision camera gave us our first clear view of its face. "Oh God," Riley whispered beside me. The features were a twisted mirror of human anatomy, familiar enough to be deeply unsettling, yet fundamentally wrong in ways that sent shivers down my spine. The pronounced brow ridge shadowed, deep-set eyes that reflected back at us with an intense reddish gleam, like those of a nocturnal predator, but far larger. The facial structure suggested intelligence, with a forehead that housed what had to be a substantial brain case. Yet the proportions were all wrong, too robust, too primitive, yet somehow too knowing. "Screenshot everything," I ordered, my fingers already flying across the keyboard. Full spectrum capture, all feeds. Those eyes held awareness, not just animal consciousness, but something that spoke of reasoning, of calculation. The creature's gaze fixed on our drone with what I could only describe as recognition. It understood exactly what it was looking at. The roar that followed hit our audio sensors like a physical force. The sound clipped our levels instantly, a deep, reverberating bellow that contained harmonics I'd never heard from any known species. It was both a warning and a challenge, and it carried for what must have been miles through the valley. Stabilization struggling, Riley reported, her voice tense as she worked the controls. The sound wave actually disrupted our hover pattern. Before I could respond, the creature moved with explosive speed that belied its massive size. In one fluid motion, it snatched up G47's severed forelimb, easily weighing 40 pounds, and hurled it skyward with terrifying accuracy. The thermal feed showed the projectile spinning through the air directly toward us. Evasive, I shouted, but Riley was already banking hard. The impact still caught us, the bare limb clipping our drone's left stabilizer. Warning indicators flashed across our screen as Riley fought with the controls, trying to compensate for the damaged equipment. We're losing stability control, she gritted out, her hands steady despite the panic I could hear in her voice. Primary gyro is compromised. I kept my focus on the creature below, determined to capture every second of footage we could. Through the wavering camera feed, I watched it gather up its grotesque harvest with practiced efficiency, movements economical. Despite its obvious strength, it kept glancing upward, tracking our drone's position with unsettling precision. Transfer all data feeds to backup drives, I ordered, not taking my eyes off the screen. Every format we have, thermal, night vision, standard video, audio, everything. The creature below us shouldered its grisly burden with ease, meat and bones that had to weigh hundreds of pounds. Just before it turned to leave, it looked up. One final time. Even through the thermal imaging, I could feel the weight of that gaze. This wasn't just an animal we'd caught hunting. This was something that understood it had been observed. Something that knew exactly what our presence meant. Those eyes haunted me. They held intelligence, yes, but more than that, they held intent. Whatever this being was, it wasn't simply reacting to us. It was thinking, planning, and somehow, I knew with bone-deep certainty that this encounter was far from over. The damaged drone limped back toward our position, Riley's skilled hands coaxing it through the air despite the compromised stabilizer. On our monitor, the thermal imaging showed the creature's heat signature moving with impossible speed through the forest. It covered 50 yards in what seemed like mere seconds, dragging G47's remains as if they weighed nothing. The massive form disappeared into the tree line, but not before our instruments captured its fluid, bipedal gait. Coming in hot, Riley announced, her voice tight with concentration. Stabilization's completely shot. The landing was rough but controlled. Our $40,000 piece of equipment skidding slightly on the gravel as Riley brought it down. The moment the rotors stopped, I was already pulling the memory cards, my hands shaking slightly as I rushed to get the footage secured. Get the backup drive, I ordered, plugging the first card into my laptop. We need copies. Multiple copies. Riley didn't respond. I heard her footsteps crunching rapidly away from our makeshift command center, followed by the unmistakable sounds of retching. I couldn't blame her. We just watched one of nature's most formidable predators being systematically taken apart like a butcher breaking down a carcass. The footage loaded, and I forced myself to review it frame by frame. The creek bed where the attack occurred was clearly visible in both thermal and night vision modes. There, in the blood-darkened soil, I could see the footprints. They were massive, easily 18 inches long, with a depth that suggested tremendous weight. The stride length alone indicated a creature that had to stand well over 9 feet. Tall, Riley, I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. I need you back here. There's something in the audio track. She returned a few minutes later, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. Her face was pale, but her eyes were focused. What did you find? I adjusted the audio settings, filtering out the ambient forest sounds. There, after the creature had disappeared into the trees with its kill, we could hear it. A series of sharp, deliberate wood knocks. 3 quick strikes, a pause, then 2 more. The pattern was too regular, too precise to be random. That's communication, Riley whispered. leaning closer to the screen. "Those aren't random sounds, that's a signal." I nodded, my mouth dry. "Help me get this backed up." "Everything. Thermal data, night vision, standard video, audio tracks. We need at least 3 copies of each." As we worked to secure the footage, I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. In 20 years of field research, I'd seen every track pattern possible from known North American wildlife. These weren't just oversized human prints. The pressure mapping and weight distribution showed clear anatomical differences. The creature's foot structure suggested adaptation for both power and stealth, with a combination of features I'd never encountered before. "The way it looked at us," Riley said quietly as she finished copying the last file. "It knew exactly what the drone was, what we were doing." She was right. That was perhaps the most unsettling part of all, the creature's immediate recognition of our surveillance technology and its deliberate response. We hadn't just documented a predator making the kill. We'd captured evidence of something that could think, plan, and react with calculated intelligence. The next morning dawned cold and clear. I barely slept, the footage from last night playing on endless loop in my mind. Officer Nora Blackwood met us at the research station at 07:00 hours. Her RCMP Wildlife Division truck carrying all the necessary evidence collection gear. She took our initial statements with professional detachment, but I noticed how she kept checking her sidearm, a Glock 20, the kind of heavy firepower meant for large predator defense. "Show me exactly where this occurred," she said, consulting her GPS. Her tone was clipped, official, but there was an underlying tension in her movements as we approached Wolverine Creek. The site was wrong. Having worked countless predator kills over my career, I expected gore, scattered remains, signs of struggle. Instead, the creek bed had been meticulously cleaned. Only dark stains in the soil and on surrounding rocks indicated anything had happened here at all. "There," Riley pointed, her voice barely above a whisper. The footprints were unmistakable, 18 inches long, deeply impressed in the creek bank mud. Officer Blackwood knelt beside them, placing evidence markers and taking photographs. Her face remained neutral, but I saw her hands trembling slightly as she used a ruler for scale. "Look at this," she said, more to herself than to us. "Dermal ridges. Like human fingerprints, but," she trailed off, measuring the depth and stride length between prints. I was examining a broken sapling when Riley's sharp intake of breath drew my attention. She was pointing upward to where G-47's radio collar hung perfectly centered on a branch, 15 feet above the ground. The height alone was unsettling, but it was the deliberate placement that sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't random. The collar had been positioned to be found. Officer Blackwood documented the collar's location, but made no move to retrieve it immediately. Instead, she walked the perimeter, marking additional prints and taking soil samples where the blood had soaked deepest into the ground. "This isn't the first incident this month," she finally said, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. "We've had 3 other predation events with similar characteristics." "Similar how?" I pressed, but she shook her head. "I'm not at liberty to discuss ongoing investigations." She sealed another evidence bag, labeling it with precise handwriting. "But I will say that in each case, the site was cleaned. And in each case," she paused, looking up at the suspended collar, "there was something left deliberately for us to find." Riley started to ask another question, but Officer Blackwood cut her off. "I've documented everything I can here. I'll need copies of all your drone footage and thermal data for the official record." She began packing up her equipment with swift, efficient movements. "And I strongly suggest you suspend your survey operations in this area until further notice." The way she emphasized "strongly suggest" made it clear this wasn't merely a recommendation. As she collected the last of her evidence bags, I noticed her checking her radio, then frowning at the display. The morning sun was bright, but the forest around us felt darker somehow, the shadows between the trees deeper than they should have been. The next 5 days became a blur of mounting horror. Each morning brought new evidence that something methodical and intelligent was systematically hunting the apex predators we'd spent years protecting. On September 30th, we found the first additional carcass, G31, a female we'd tracked since she was a cub. The precision of the dismemberment was identical to what we'd witnessed with G47. Clean separations at major joints, organs sorted by type, and those same massive tracks in the surrounding soil. I'd set up 3 Reconyx trail cameras that evening, carefully concealing them in the dense brush. When we returned the next morning, 2 had been twisted into unrecognizable shapes, while the third was found mounted perfectly level on a different tree. Lens pointed directly at the sky. October 1st brought 2 more casualties, D22 and G39. Both mature males weighing over 500 pounds each. The kill sites were less than a quarter-mile apart, suggesting coordinated hunting that defied everything I knew about North American predators. Riley noticed it first. The dismemberment pattern was exactly the same, down to the order of separated joints and placement of internal organs. This wasn't animal behavior. This was procedure. We attempted to document everything, but our equipment kept failing us. Batteries that should have lasted days died within hours. Memory cards corrupted inexplicably. The only camera that survived was an old film Canon that Riley had brought as a backup. The prints we photographed with it showed the same dermal ridges that Officer Blackwood had documented. Distinct patterns that spoke of something far too human-like for comfort. The morning of October 2nd started like the others, crisp, clear, and filled with dread. We'd left our last functioning trail camera near a game trail the previous evening, hoping to finally capture clear footage of whatever was stalking our research subjects. I parked our ATV about 50 yards from the research trailer, immediately noticing something was wrong. The gravel around our temporary home had been disturbed. "Daniel," Riley's voice cracked as she pointed to the ground. The tracks circled our trailer completely, 18-inch prints pressed deep into the soil, showing something massive had walked a deliberate perimeter around our shelter while we were away. My hands shook as I followed the circuit, counting 8 complete rotations, but it was the trailer itself that made my blood run cold. At 9 feet off the ground, deep gouges ran along the aluminum siding. 4 parallel marks, spaced like fingers, had torn through the metal with a force that seemed impossible. Whatever had made those marks could have easily reached through our roof while we slept. "We need to call Officer Blackwood," Riley said, her face pale as she documented the damage with her camera. "This isn't random anymore. It's watching us, studying us." I reached for the satellite phone with trembling fingers, remembering Silas's warning about the old giants. All those years of dismissing local knowledge as folklore seemed arrogant now, with the evidence literally carved into our shelter. The tracks told a story of something that walked on 2 legs, used tools with precision, and possessed strength beyond any known species. And now it knew exactly where we slept. The morning of October 3rd, I was reviewing the thermal footage for the 100th time when 3 unmarked black SUVs rolled up to our research trailer. 8 individuals in Parks Canada uniforms emerged, followed by 2 men in dark suits who moved with military precision. Before I could even stand up from my desk, they were through the door. "Dr. Daniel Brutus?" The taller suit approached, showing federal credentials. "I'm Garrett Stendahl. We need to secure all your equipment and documentation immediately." Within minutes, they had systematically boxed up our hard drives, cameras, and field journals. One agent specifically sought out my personal laptop's backup drive, hidden in the false bottom of my equipment case, something I hadn't told anyone about. That's when I realized this wasn't a standard investigation. They separated Riley and me, placing us in different vehicles for questioning. I spent 4 hours with Stendahl in the back of an SUV, recounting every detail of the past week while he recorded my statement. His questions were oddly specific, focused on behavioral patterns, rather than the violent encounters themselves. Did you notice any structured arrangements of bones or branches near the kill sites? He asked. Any signs of tool modification or catching behavior? When I mentioned the methodical dismemberment patterns, Stendhal nodded as if confirming something. Similar to case 274B in Nahani last spring, he muttered to his colleague. What do you mean similar cases? I demanded. How long have you known about these creatures? Stendhal's expression shifted subtly. Dr. Brutus, you've had an exemplary career in wildlife biology. 20 years of peer-reviewed research, multiple grants, tenure-track position. It would be unfortunate if your reputation became associated with more sensational claims. Are you threatening me? I'm reminding you that ecological management requires discretion. He pulled out a tablet, showing me a map of northern Canada marked with dozens of incident clusters. What you've documented here isn't unique. We've been tracking these interactions for decades. But public panic helps no one. Imagine the chaos if people believed apex predators were being systematically hunted by an unknown species. The public has a right to know what's out there, I argued. Do they? Stendhal's voice hardened. And what happens to the wilderness areas when armed civilians flood in, looking for monsters? What happens to your research sites when they're overrun by trophy hunters and conspiracy theorists? He slid a thick document across the seat. This is a non-disclosure agreement. Sign it, and you'll maintain your permits and funding. Your drone footage and other evidence will be classified under national security protocols. And if I refuse, then we'll have to examine your grant allocations very carefully. Perhaps audit your methods. I'm sure the university board would be interested in some of your more unorthodox field observations. I thought about my life's work, my reputation, everything I'd built. Then I thought about those tracks around our trailer. The methodical dismemberment of G47, the calculated destruction of our cameras. The public really did have a right to know. But as I opened my mouth to refuse, Stendhal added quietly, we're not the only ones who want this kept quiet. Dr. Brutus, these creatures have survived this long by managing witnesses. They're intelligent, enough to understand cameras and research equipment. Intelligent enough to send messages about boundaries, like circling your trailer. Think carefully about which kind of warning you'd prefer to receive. I waited until the officials were distracted with Riley's interview to make my move. Years of fieldwork had taught me to always have contingencies, in this case, a waterproof capsule hidden beneath the trailer's sewage tank. While pretending to check our generator's fuel level, I slipped 3 micro SD cards and a portable drive into the capsule. 20 years of research had made me paranoid about backing up data. Thank God. Inside the trailer, I could hear them dismantling our workstation. They were thorough, logging every piece of equipment into evidence bags. But they couldn't know about the footage I'd automatically mirrored to an encrypted cloud server the night before. Some habits from my divorce had proved useful. Never keep all your data in one place. Through the window, I watched Riley being interviewed by 2 Parks Canada officers. She seemed calm, but I noticed her phone propped casually on her knee, its voice recorder likely running. Smart girl. She'd positioned herself so the phone's camera had a clear view of the officials' faces. We'd never discussed this contingency, but she'd clearly thought ahead. Stendhal called me back into the trailer, spreading a topographical map across our research table. Red dots marked what he called Class 4 fauna incidents across thousands of square miles. Each point had a date and case number. Some went back to the 1970s. Nahani Valley, 1976, he pointed. 3 experienced hunters disappeared. Official report cites grizzly attack despite no bodies found. Dawson City, 1982. Geological survey team records equipment interference and unexplained thermal signatures. Mount Logan, 1995. Parks Canada closes entire valley for 6 months after unusual predator behavior pattern. The pattern was undeniable. Each incident had been carefully reframed, explained away, buried in bureaucratic language. I thought about G47's collar, deliberately hung 15 feet high. These weren't just animal attacks, they were messages. Sign. Here, and initial each page, Stendhal said, sliding over a thick document. This classifies everything you've witnessed under Section 18 of the National Security Information Act. Disclosure carries a minimum 10-year sentence. As I read through the agreement, my hand trembling slightly, I noticed Riley through the window. She was signing her own copy, but her phone was still recording. We'd need that evidence later. The language was comprehensive. We couldn't publish, couldn't discuss our findings, couldn't even hint at what we'd seen. Our research would be redacted, our data classified. 20 years of studying predator behavior, and the most significant discovery of my career would vanish into some government vault. Your revised permits will arrive next week, Stendhal said. As I signed the final page, stick to conventional wildlife studies. No more night surveys in this region. No more thermal imaging. Consider this a professional courtesy. He tapped the map one last time, and I noticed something I hadn't before. The incident clusters formed a pattern, not random attacks, but a territory being systematically defended. These creatures weren't just surviving in the modern world. They were actively managing their boundaries, using calculated displays of force to maintain their privacy. I handed back the signed documents, knowing the real evidence was already secured. Whatever Stendhal and his team thought they were containing, the truth was already backed up in triplicate. The question now was what to do with it. I sat in my emptied university office, staring at the formal letter explaining my department. Restructuring. 20 years of research, hundreds of published papers, and suddenly my position had become non-essential. The timing wasn't subtle. Riley texted me using our agreed-upon code, a complaint about losing hiking gear, which meant she'd secured a safe meeting location. We met at a small coffee shop in North Vancouver, far from campus and familiar faces. She looked different in city clothes, the field-hardened researcher replaced by a nervous graduate student. They're pushing me towards studying salmon migration patterns instead, she whispered, sliding into the booth. My advisor suddenly has concerns about the viability of large predator research. I pulled out my laptop, positioning it so only we could see the screen. The backup drives had survived, hidden in my old field journal's false bottom. I've been analyzing the footage frame by frame, I said, keeping my voice low. There's something we missed in the chaos. The thermal imaging showed the creature methodically processing G47's remains. What we'd first seen as random butchery now revealed itself as precise expertise. The being used at least 3 distinct stone tools, one for skin and muscle, another for joint separation, and a smaller implement for organ removal. Look at the organ piles, Riley pointed. They're sorted by type. Liver and heart separate from intestines. That's not animal behavior, that's butchery knowledge. I nodded, advancing to a clearer frame. The tool marks are consistent across all 4 carcasses we found. Same technique, same arrangement. This isn't opportunistic feeding, it's a practiced method. Riley pulled out her phone, showing me her audio analysis software. I've been studying the sound files. There's something in the sub-bass range, almost below human hearing. She pressed play, and through her headphones, I heard it. Rhythmic pulses underlying the creature's movements. These match other recordings, she said, switching to a different file. Wisconsin, 2019. Oregon, 2021. All classified as equipment. Malfunctions or unexplained acoustic phenomena. But the pattern is identical. Low-frequency vocalizations during predator encounters. The coffee shop felt suddenly too exposed. I closed the laptop, trying to process what we were seeing. This wasn't just evidence of an unknown species. It was proof of intelligence, of cultural knowledge passed down through generations. The precise cuts, the sorted organs, the arranged bones. These weren't random acts but learned behaviors. The bone arrangements, Riley continued, her voice barely audible. They're consistent too. Always pointing northeast, always with the largest bones, forming a central axis. I checked with my grandmother. Some First Nation stories mention similar patterns, markers left by the tall ones to claim territory. My hand shook slightly as I sipped my coffee. Everything I thought I knew about North American wildlife. Taxonomy was unraveling. These beings weren't just surviving on the fringes. They were maintaining complex behaviors, using tools, communicating across vast distances with infrasound. They're watching us back, Riley said, echoing my thoughts. Studying our patterns, our weaknesses. G47 wasn't just prey, he was a message. They're showing us they can take down our apex predators whenever they choose. The implications were staggering. How long had they been there, observing our research, letting us think we were the ones doing the studying? How many other incidents had been buried in classified files and revised permits? The spring rain drummed against my apartment windows. As I stared at the unmarked manila envelope that had appeared in my mailbox. No return address, no identifying marks, just my name and address typed on a clean label. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Several high-resolution trail camera photos slid onto my desk, and my throat went dry. The timestamp showed October 17th, 2023, just 2 weeks after we'd been forced out of Kluwen. The location was unmistakable. Wolverine Creek, where we'd witnessed P-47's violent end. But what the photos showed made my blood run cold. 3 figures moved through the frame in crisp detail. The largest, easily 9 feet tall, led the group with the same powerful grace we'd witnessed that night. Behind it, a slightly smaller adult, perhaps 8 feet in height, moved with similar precision. But it was the third figure that shook. Me to my core, a juvenile, no more than 6 feet tall, learning from the adults. They were gathered around a distinct mound of earth and arranged bones that could only be G47's final resting place. A handwritten note accompanied the photos. The writing precise but hurried. They remember faces and scents. Stay away from the northern forests. I recognized the letterhead, Parks Canada, though it had been carefully torn to remove any identifying information. My phone buzzed, Riley's name flashing on the screen. I hadn't heard from her since she'd taken the urban wildlife management position in Vancouver, both of us keeping our distance to avoid raising suspicions. Daniel? Her voice was tight with panic. Something's wrong. I've been monitoring the North Shore watersheds for bear activity, but, she paused, catching her breath, I'm finding tracks. Big ones. 18 inches, just like at Wolverine Creek. They're moving south, following the river valleys toward the city. I looked back at the photos spread across my desk. Riley, I just received something. Trail camera images from Kluwen, taken after we left. There wasn't just one of them, there's a family group, and they're teaching their young. Oh God, she whispered. The tracks here, they're different sizes too. Multiple individuals. Daniel, they're expanding their territory. All those bears we tagged over the years, we thought we were mapping their ranges, but we were really seeing where they'd been pushed out of. I studied the images more closely, noting details I'd missed at first glance. The juvenile was mimicking the adult's movements exactly, learning their hunting techniques. These weren't just animals. They were passing down knowledge, maintaining a culture we'd barely glimpsed. The tracks I'm finding, Riley continued, they're fresh. Maybe a day old, and they're not random. They're following the same creek systems we used to study, moving between the same valleys. It's like they're using our own research to map their expansion. I thought about the warning note, its message clear. We'd crossed a line with our documentation, violated some unspoken boundary, and now they were moving, following ancient pathways down from the northern forests toward our populated areas. "Riley," I said, "where exactly are you seeing these tracks?" "That's the thing, Daniel. They're getting closer to the hiking trails, the watershed access roads. Last week they were 10 miles out. Yesterday, I found prints just 4 miles from the city limits. They're not hiding anymore." I'm writing this final account from my small apartment in Toronto, as far as I could reasonably get from the mountain forests of British Columbia, while still maintaining some semblance of an academic career. Though career might be too generous a term for what remains of my life's work. I've taken an adjunct position teaching introductory biology courses, my research credentials effectively stripped away after Cluen, the scientific worldview I'd built over 20 years of field research shattered that night at Wolverine Creek. I used to dismiss local stories and traditional knowledge as folklore, convinced that our modern methods and technology could explain everything in rational terms. Now I understand we were barely scratching the surface of what exists in those ancient forests. Last week, a former colleague who still has access to government satellite data sent me something disturbing. The thermal imaging maps of the Cluen region show massive heat, signatures moving in coordinated patterns through valleys where no large mammals should be able to survive the winter. More telling are the dead zones, entire watersheds where grizzly populations have simply vanished, leaving ecological voids that defy our understanding of predator-prey dynamics. The creatures, I still struggle with what to call them, aren't just real. They're intelligent in ways that terrify me. After our encounter, subsequent drone surveys in the region have turned up nothing. No thermal signatures, no clear footage, just destroyed equipment and those massive footprints. They've learned to recognize and avoid our surveillance technology, adapting faster than we can track them. But what keeps me awake at night isn't their intelligence or even their strength. It's their migration patterns. Climate change is pushing traditional wildlife corridors southward, and they're following the food sources. The tracks Riley found near Vancouver weren't an isolated incident. Similar reports have surfaced across British Columbia's populated regions, though they're quickly buried by the same authorities who confiscated our footage. I still have those backup drives hidden away, and sometimes late at night, I review the footage from P-47's last moments. Not for the violence, I've seen enough of that, but for the purposeful way they moved, the tools they used, the evidence of generational knowledge being passed down. We didn't just document a predator that night. We witnessed something that has been watching us, learning from us, and perhaps most chillingly, adapting to our presence in what they consider their territory. The warning note that came with those family group photos sits on my desk as I write this. They remember faces and scents. I believe it now. They're not just surviving in our world, they're strategizing, expanding, and moving closer to our population centers with each passing season. And we, in our scientific arrogance, are only just beginning to realize what's been hiding in plain sight all along. If this story lingered with you, subscribe. I'll return tomorrow with more.